Victor Lebruno and his wife Louise, workers from the Breton fishing town of Concarneau, arrived at Île Saint Paul in the southern Indian Ocean, equipped with little more than the tools of their trade and the assurances of their employer. In March of 1930, they departed the island with the main body of workers at the close of the lobster season, then turned back. 7 of them stayed behind to guard the factory installations through the coming winter, promised that a company relief boat would return within 2 to 3 months. There were no communications equipment left behind. There was no rescue plan. There was no easy way out. Concarneau is a small walled town on the Atlantic coast of Brittany, in the northwestern corner of France, where the fishing industry is not merely an occupation, but a way of organizing one's entire life. The smell of brine and diesel hangs in the harbor air year-round. Families who fish tend to have fished for generations. The men and women who signed contracts with La Langouste Française, the French lobster company, in October of 1929, were not reckless adventurers. They were working people responding to a specific economic opportunity at a difficult moment in French economic history. The Bosier brothers, who ran the company under the umbrella of the Compagnie Générale des Îles Kerguelen, promised each worker 600 francs a month, along with housing and provisions fully supplied. For a skilled fishing laborer in 1929, it was a serious sum of money. Victor Lebruno was drawn by exactly this. Louise, his wife, was pregnant when they sailed. That detail is not incidental. It is the precise weight at the center of everything that followed. Of the 30 Europeans who traveled to the island that season, most were from Concarneau or the wider region of Brittany. Among them was Louis Erledon, a quiet man who had the habit of keeping a diary, a practice that would eventually become the primary record of what happened. There was also Emmanuel Pouloc, a Breton laborer, and François Ramamongi, a young man from Madagascar, one of several Malagasy workers the company had also recruited, and Julien Le Houledoux, another Concarneau native, and Pierre Le Killevic, steady and practical, who had a fisherman's instinct for reading the sea. These were people known to one another before they departed France, connected by the close geography of a small harbor town, the kind of familiarity where you know a man's family name before you know his face. The lobster cannery at Île Saint Paul was not a romantic outpost. It was a commercial operation. Iron canning equipment, storage sheds, open tanks for processing, a modest barracks where workers slept in rows. The buildings were constructed from local stone, cut from the volcanic walls of the island, and supplemented with corrugated iron, the kind of structure that is functional and nothing more. The company had stocked the facility with canned provisions sufficient for the working season, tins of meat, preserved vegetables, hardtack, and maintained a small amount of garden ground where workers attempted, with mixed results, to grow fresh produce. The island's water came from collection systems fed by rainfall and from the cold thermal springs that seeped up through the volcanic rock at the crater's edge. There was a small boat kept at the harbor. There were tools for maintaining the machinery. There were blankets. There were letters that had been written but not yet sent, stacked in the barracks and waiting for the next ship. Île Saint Paul sits at 38 degrees 43 minutes south latitude, more than 3,000 kilometers southeast of Réunion, the nearest inhabited French territory. It is not a place of gentle isolation. The island is the uppermost rim of an active volcanic cone rising from the floor of the Indian Ocean, triangular in shape, no more than 5 kilometers at its widest point. Its eastern face presents sheer basalt cliffs that drop straight into heavy surf. The interior crater, whose walls once formed a complete volcanic bowl, was breached by the sea sometime before written record, leaving a 100-meter channel through which only the smallest vessels can pass. That interior basin, 1 kilometer wide, 50 meters deep, is ringed by walls rising 270 meters above the water, walls so steep and darkened with volcanic mineral that they appear almost black against the gray sky. The slopes above the crater are covered in coarse grass that whips and bends constantly in the wind, because this island lies squarely within the belt of persistent westerly gales that sailors have called the Roaring Forties since the age of sail. Those winds do not pause seasonally. They do not moderate out of sympathy for human plans. They flay exposed skin in winter, capsize small boats without warning, and make the planting of any garden a contest between human intention and raw atmospheric force. The nearest significant landmass is Antarctica. Luke pursued somewhere beyond the southern horizon. The nearest inhabited island is Île Amsterdam, 85 kilometers to the north, itself uninhabited except for a small research station. Île Saint Paul is a place where the Earth has arranged its geography specifically to be difficult. The island's population in any given year, if it could be called a population, consisted of whatever creatures had evolved or been introduced to tolerate those conditions. Rockhopper penguins nested by the thousands on the cliff edges and the adjacent sea stack of Quilly Rock, making a sound that carries clearly across the crater when the wind allows. A harsh, staccato bark, nothing like the birds of warmer latitudes. Subantarctic fur seals hauled themselves onto the black volcanic ledges and regarded intruders with the hostility of animals that have learned no fear of anything the island offers. The thermal springs at the crater's edge sent thin columns of steam into the cold air, a geological comfort that the island provided without intention, and the workers had learned to appreciate without gratitude. It was beautiful, in the way that most hostile places are beautiful, objectively, from a sufficient distance, with the knowledge that you do not have to remain. In March of 1930, at the close of the second lobster season, the company boat arrived to ferry the main workforce back toward civilization. Most of the 30 workers filed aboard. 7 did not. Victor Lebrunu stayed. Louise, now visibly pregnant, stayed with him. Louis Erledin stayed. Julien Le Houloudou stayed. Pierre Lekilovic stayed. Manuel Pouloc stayed. And François Ramamongi, the young Malagasy, stayed. Their task was simple on paper: watch over the canning equipment through the winter months, prevent deterioration or theft. From whom, on a deserted island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, was never clearly explained, and await the resupply vessel the company promised to dispatch within 2 to 3 months. They watched the boat diminish into the gray distance of the southern Indian Ocean until it was swallowed entirely by the horizon. Then they turned back toward the buildings. The island offered only its usual sound: wind and the distant concussion of surf against the eastern cliffs, and the intermittent cry of rockhopper penguins from somewhere below the crater rim. There was no radio. There was no emergency beacon. There was no written agreement specifying what would happen if the boat did not come. The first weeks passed in reasonable order. The 7 remaining workers divided the maintenance tasks among themselves and settled into a routine that had the texture, if not the substance, of normalcy. Erledin documented the condition of the canning equipment in his diary. Pierre Lekilovic kept the small harbor vessel in serviceable condition, checking and rechecking the oarlocks and hull seams against the corrosive work of salt air. Manuel Pouloc and François Ramamongi tended to what remained of the garden plot, working the thin volcanic soil with the same methodical patience they had applied all season, though the winds were already making clear that they had no interest in cooperation. Victor Lebrunu spent his mornings on equipment inventory, and his afternoons helping Louise, whose pregnancy had advanced to the point where she could no longer perform most of the heavy work. Julien de Houloudou, calm by temperament and practical by training, took on whatever was needed without complaint. They rationed their canned provisions carefully. They collected rainfall when it came. They estimated they had enough to last comfortably until the company boat returned, and they permitted themselves the daily, small satisfaction of that estimate. The company had promised 2 to 3 months. They wrote letters they intended to send when the boat arrived. April passed. Then May. The garden yielded almost nothing, the winds stripping tender shoots before they could establish. The canned provisions, which had been calculated for a partial winter stay, began to run lower than the timeline justified. No boat appeared on the northern horizon. In the late spring of 1930, Louise Le Bruneau gave birth to a daughter on Île Saint Paul. There was no doctor. There was no medical equipment beyond the minimal first aid stores the cannery kept for industrial injuries. The birth was managed by the people present on the island, in the stone barracks that smelled of iron and salt, while the wind ran its continuous argument against the corrugated roof. They named the girl Paule. She was the only human being ever born on that island, as far as any record shows. A life beginning in the most remote place that 7 French workers had ever been, at precisely the worst possible moment in their collective circumstance. Louise held Paul against the warmth of her body in the weeks that followed, and the others gathered what comfort they could offer, and the island continued to provide exactly what it had always provided: wind and cold and the indifferent sound of the sea. Paule Le Bruneau lived for 2 months. She died of malnutrition, her own body's resources limited by what her mother could provide, and her mother's resources limited by a diet of canned goods and penguin eggs on an island 3,000 kilometers from the nearest hospital. 2 months. The infant was buried somewhere on the volcanic ground of Île Saint Paul, in a grave dug by her father with the tools available, on an island that had no soil deep enough to feel like earth, and no silence deep enough to feel like peace. Louise did not record her own reaction. What exists in the historical record is the fact itself, and the particular silence that surrounds it. There was no time to grieve, not completely. The living demanded continued attention. By July of 1930, the first visible symptoms of scurvy had appeared among the workers. The disease moves slowly in its opening stages: fatigue, joint ache, irritability, all of which can be mistaken for the ordinary miseries of physical labor in a hard environment. Then the signs become unambiguous. The gums darken and bleed. The legs begin to swell, filling with yellowish fluid that pools beneath the skin and makes movement increasingly painful. Old wounds reopen. The body begins to unmake itself from the inside with systematic efficiency. Scurvy is caused by the depletion of vitamin C, a compound the human body cannot manufacture and must receive from fresh food: citrus, vegetables, raw meat, none of which the 7 workers had in any reliable quantity. The canned provisions offered no vitamin C whatsoever. The winds had destroyed the garden. The penguin eggs provided protein and fat, but nothing sufficient to reverse the deficiency already taking hold in their tissues. They knew what the disease was. Breton fishermen of that era understood scurvy at least by name, as a danger of long voyages without fresh food. But understanding a disease and being able to treat it, on an island with no medical supplies and no means of communication, are entirely different problems. In the last days of July 1930, Emmanuel died. He had been among the more physically robust of the group at the start. Scurvy does not honor prior strength. It works through depletion, not through assault, dismantling the body's capacity to repair itself until the ordinary stresses of existence, the strain of standing upright, the effort of breathing deeply, exceed what the tissues can sustain. Emmanuel died on Île Saint Paul, more than 4,000 kilometers from his home in Brittany, surrounded by 6 people who could do nothing to save him, and who now faced the knowledge that the same process was advancing in their own bodies. They buried him. Then they waited. François Ramamongi died next. The young Malagasy man who had come to the island from a different continent, recruited by the same company promises, had survived everything that the island had offered, until scurvy made its final claim. He died in the weeks following Manuel's death, in August of 1930, in a barracks room that was growing quieter with each passing week. Erlédon wrote in his diary around this period, "On this island where you have nothing, you have a cemetery. The sentence is without self-pity. It is simply an observation. That flatness of register is itself a kind of testimony. The voice of a man who has moved past shock into the dull accuracy of someone learning to live inside catastrophe. Victor Le Bruneau died next. Louise was present. She had been watching her husband's condition decline with the specific helplessness of knowing exactly what was happening and being entirely unable to alter it. Victor had stayed on the island because of the company's promise. He had stayed because Louise was pregnant, and the journey home would have been difficult, and the relief boat would come in 2 to 3 months. He died on a volcanic island 7 kilometers across in the middle of the Indian Ocean, in the same month that summer was beginning in France, leaving his wife alone with 2 deaths already behind her. Her daughter, and now her husband. And the flat sound of the wind and the sea her only company beyond the 2 surviving men and whatever internal resources she could locate in herself. There were now 4: Louise, Louis Erledon, Julien Le Houledu, and Pierre Le Kilivic. Pierre Le Kilivic had kept the small harbor boat in working order from the beginning. A practical man, a fisherman's son from Concarneau, he understood the sea well enough to know what the boat was capable of in the conditions around Île Saint Paul, and he understood it well enough to know that the attempt he was now considering was genuinely dangerous. The swells in the roaring 40s ran 4 to 6 meters on calm days. The boat was small. He had no navigation instruments beyond a compass, no way to signal for help if he found himself in difficulty, no guarantee that any vessel would be within range of his position in those waters. But the alternative was remaining on the island as the scurvy advanced through all of them, and hoping that a company that had already abandoned them for 6 months would eventually remember they existed. He made his decision with the clarity of someone who has exhausted all alternatives that carry a reasonable expectation of survival. He took what supplies could be spared, checked the seams of the small vessel one final time, and departed into the Indian Ocean in search of help. Pierre Le Kilivic was never seen again. The sea took him. Whether the boat capsized in the roaring 40s swells, whether he became lost in fog without navigation instruments, whether he made landfall somewhere and succumbed before help could be organized, no record exists. His disappearance was complete. He was added in absentia to the count of the dead. Meanwhile, far from the volcanic crater where the 3 survivors clung to existence, in the small harbor town of Concarneau on the Atlantic coast of Brittany, life had continued in its ordinary rhythms. Families had expected their workers home by late spring. When spring passed and the men and women did not return, the families wrote to the Bosier brothers. They received reassurances. The letters were polite, professional, and inaccurate. The company had failed to dispatch a relief vessel on the promised schedule, and rather than organizing an emergency response, the management had allowed weeks to accumulate into months, while 7 workers, one of them pregnant, all of them dependent on a food supply calculated for a short stay, remained stranded without communication on one of the most remote islands on Earth. No French maritime authority had been alerted. No emergency vessel had been commissioned. The families of the workers in Concarneau knew nothing with certainty. They knew only that the promised return had not occurred, and that the company's explanations were growing less specific with each exchange. In Concarneau that summer, the families of the dead did not yet know they were the families of the dead. Manuel Poulac's wife had a daughter and a son and a husband she expected to return from work. Victor Le Bruneau's daughter Maria was 5 years old and being cared for by relatives while her parents earned the wages that would stabilize the family's finances. François Ramamongi had people waiting for him in Madagascar, at a distance from Concarneau that made his situation even more invisible to the community organizing itself around the missing. The institutional silence of La Langouste Française was not dramatic. It did not announce itself as culpable. It simply persisted, in the form of unanswered questions and increasingly vague correspondence across the months when intervention would have been possible and meaningful. Hervé Pouloc, the grandson of Manuel Pouloc, would say decades later, "My grandfather had a miserable life. His death left my grandmother, my aunt, and my father in total destitution." That observation carries the weight of everything the company's failure cost. Not only the dead, but every person connected to them. Back on the island, the 3 remaining survivors had reorganized their existence around the simplest possible goal: do not die today. Louise, Erlédan, and Le Houloudoute managed the remaining provisions with the kind of arithmetic that becomes second nature under scarcity, tracking what remained, what could be gathered, what the body required against what the island could offer. The penguins were the primary resource. The rockhopper penguin colony on the island and on the adjacent outcrop of Quillet Rock numbered in the thousands. Their eggs could be collected from the cliffside nests with effort and risk, and the eggs provided enough protein and fat to sustain basic metabolic function. They were not a cure for scurvy, but they were the difference between starvation and its absence, and on Île Saint Paul in the winter of 1930, that distinction was everything. The thermal springs at the crater's edge provided water. This was not a small thing. Fresh water on a volcanic island surrounded by salt water is not guaranteed, and the springs gave the 3 survivors one resource that could not be exhausted by the company's negligence or the island's indifference. Erlédan recorded the daily routine in the terse, itemizing language of his diary. The morning walk to collect eggs, the maintenance of the stone shelter against the wind, the evening fire when fuel permitted, the slow consumption of what remained in the cans. He wrote about the sea obsessively, watching the northern horizon at the same hours each day, cataloging the weather, noting the approach of clouds and their failure to become anything other than more clouds. The wind was constant, not merely present but insistent, a low-frequency pressure that entered the body through the skin and settled in the joints and became, over weeks and months, less a meteorological condition than an emotional one. The roaring 40s are named with accuracy. The westerlies at that latitude blow without the interruption of significant landmass for much of their circuit around the globe, building fetch and speed across thousands of kilometers of open ocean before arriving at Île Saint Paul with the full force of that unobstructed journey. In winter, they drove horizontal rain across the island at speeds that made it difficult to walk in a straight line. The cold was not the killing cold of the Arctic, but it was persistent and damp, the kind that does not relent between its intrusions and that, combined with inadequate nutrition, works on the human body with particular efficiency. Erlédan wrote, "We are lulled by words, promises, lies." The sentence appears in his diary at a point when the 3 survivors had been waiting long enough that hope had undergone a transformation. Not into despair exactly, but into something harder and less susceptible to injury. The company had made specific promises: wages, housing, provisions, a return boat in 2 to 3 months. The provisions had been inadequate from the start. The boat had not come. 4 of the 7 people who had trusted those promises were now dead. What remained for the living was not optimism, but something closer to stubbornness. A refusal to concede to the island's patience, which was infinite. There were days when ships appeared on the horizon. This happened more than once across the 9 months they spent on the island. A silhouette against the gray distance of the Indian Ocean, the kind of shape that resolves, if you watch it long enough, into either a vessel or a cloud bank. Erlédan recorded these sightings without elaboration, which is its own kind of statement. The ships passed. They were far. They had no reason to approach an island marked on charts as uninhabited, and they disappeared back into the horizon with the same unhurried authority with which they had appeared. Whether those aboard saw the island at all is unknown. Whether a fire was lit in response, the survivors' most reliable signaling option, is not recorded. The horizon reasserted its emptiness, and the three survivors returned to their routines. The worst of these episodes came sometime in September, when a vessel appeared close enough to the island that its hull could be distinguished clearly from the cliff edge vantage point above the crater. It was not a silhouette. It had a shape, a size, a particularity that made it unmistakably real and unmistakably near. Erledon's diary entry for that period records the sighting with the same flat precision he brought to everything, but the entry is longer than most, and its length is its own confession. The three survivors watched. The vessel altered course, not toward the island, but away from it, following a line that took it across the outer arc of visibility, and then beyond it. There is a cruelty particular to hope that approaches and then does not arrive, that has no adequate name. The crater harbor was silent afterward, except for the penguins and the surf. Louise was 31 years old. She had been on the island for 6 months. She was going to be on it for 3 more. The days organized themselves into a rhythm that had the appearance of purpose, even when purpose itself was difficult to locate. Morning. Egg collection from the penguin colony, a task that required descending toward the cliff edges and managing the birds' territorial aggression with patience and practiced movement, a skill that took time to acquire, and that, once acquired, represented one of the few genuine progressions from incompetence to competence that the island permitted. Midday. The worst of the wind, which drove them inside the stone buildings and made outdoor work largely impossible. They had learned to use this forced interior time for repairs, the constant small maintenance of clothing and equipment that deterioration required, sewing torn seams with whatever thread remained, relashing the barracks shutters against the pressure of the afternoon gusts. Afternoon. The light lasting long enough in the southern hemisphere's summer to allow a second round of maintenance. Patching the barracks roof against the rain, checking the water collection system, inventorying what remained of the canned stores. Evening. The fire, if fuel allowed. The stars, when the cloud cover broke. The sound of the waves in the crater harbor, where the water moved in slow, rolling swells that the channel's narrowness transformed into something almost gentle, incongruous against the ferocity of the outer sea. The canned stores reached a point at which each tin was counted and rationed by weight rather than by number, divided into portions that satisfied the arithmetic of survival while falling significantly short of what the body actually required. Erledon noted these quantities in his diary with the same even-handedness with which he noted the weather. The act of documentation was itself a form of maintenance. Keeping the diary meant keeping the mental posture of a person whose experience might someday matter to someone else. And that posture was not nothing. It was a reason to be precise. It was a reason to remain, even partially, oriented toward a world beyond the island's perimeter. Louise Lebrunu, in the months after Victor's death, was doing something that has no clean name in the language of survival narratives. She was not merely persisting. She was maintaining the internal framework of a person who intends to return home. She had buried her daughter. She had watched her husband die. She had watched 2 other men die. She had watched a 4th paddle away into the Indian Ocean and not return. She was living on penguin eggs and canned provisions on a 5-kilometer volcanic island in the middle of the Indian Ocean with 2 other people, waiting for a company that had already demonstrated its indifference to their existence. She did not collapse. She did not stop. The historical record does not preserve her inner voice the way Erledon's diary preserves his. What it preserves is the fact of her survival, and that is its own kind of document, the most resistant kind, the kind that requires no words at all. In October of 1930, a shape appeared on the horizon that did not resolve into a cloud bank. The 3 survivors watched it approach with the particular quality of attention that accumulates over months of false alarms, Not hope exactly, but its careful, defended precursor. The shape grew, defined itself, became unmistakably a vessel. It entered the outer approaches to the island. It slowed. It was real. On December 6, 1930, the boat came to rest in the island's crater harbor. It had not come to rescue them. It had come to deliver new workers for the upcoming lobster season. No one aboard had any idea what had been happening on the island. The company had dispatched the vessel on its ordinary commercial schedule, 9 months after the 7 workers had been left behind, not as a response to alarm or emergency, but as a routine operational function. The new arrivals stepped off the boat onto the dock and found 3 survivors waiting for them. Gaunt, wind-darkened, worn in the way that only months of inadequate food and absolute isolation produce. The new workers were accompanied by something no one on the island had anticipated. Louise Le Brunoux's other daughter, Maria, 5 years old, had traveled on the boat from France. She had come without knowing what had happened to her family. She had come, hoping to see her father. Louis Erledon left on the boat. He had been on the island for 9 months. He carried his diary. He carried the weight of 4 deaths. He left. Julien Le Houloudou did not leave. Louise Le Brunoux did not leave. The reasons attributed to Louise in the historical record include the arrival of Maria, who had now appeared in this place that had taken everything from her, and the possibility that Louise wished to remain near the graves of her husband and her daughter, to eventually bring their remains home. Some accounts suggest she hoped to complete 1 more commercial season and earn enough to re-establish her life in Concarneau. The truth is likely all of these things at once, in a proportion that does not submit to clean narrative explanation. She stayed. She was on Île Saint Paul for a 3rd consecutive season, now with her living daughter beside her, surrounded by the graves of her dead. The 3rd season was the last. The new workers who arrived in December of 1930 were primarily Malagasy, laborers recruited from Madagascar in the pattern the company had established. During the season that followed, 44 of them died from beriberi, a disease caused by deficiency of thiamine, vitamin B1, resulting in inflammation of the nerves and heart failure. Beriberi, like scurvy, is a disease of institutional neglect. Its presence indicates a food supply so deficient in basic nutrients that the bodies depending on it have no physiological recourse. The Bosier brothers' company had spent years supplying its island workforce with provisions that could not sustain human health through an extended stay. The disease had arrived through the same mechanism as the scurvy that had killed 4 of the first group. The scale had simply expanded. 44 people died on Île Saint Paul in the first months of 1931, in the island's stone barracks, in a place so remote that the French mainland would not learn of it until survivors returned with testimony. La Langouste Française went bankrupt shortly thereafter. The Bosier brothers' company, undone finally by the accumulated weight of its own negligence, collapsed into insolvency. Louise Le Brunoux, Julien Le Houloudou, and Maria finally left the island. Louise had now survived 3 consecutive seasons on Île Saint Paul, outlasting her employer, outlasting the death count that the island and the company had between them produced, outlasting every piece of the original plan, except herself. When Louis Erledon returned to France and broke his silence, the story he told provoked outrage. The French press called the abandoned workers les esclaves de l'île de la mort, the slaves of the island of death. The families of the dead and the survivors organized and, in 1931, brought suit against La Langouste Française. The trial lasted 6 years. On April 19, 1937, a French court delivered its verdict. La Langouste Française was found responsible for the deaths. The Bosier brothers' company was convicted. Compensation was ordered. Louise Le Brunoux was promised 55,000 French francs. The other families received corresponding judgments. The conviction was real. The legal accountability was documented and on record. The money was never paid. The company was bankrupt. The judgment was valid and unenforceable simultaneously. The 6 years that the families had spent in court produced a legal finding that acknowledged the truth of what had happened and proved wholly unable to provide material remedy for it. The survivors and the families of the dead received the cold satisfaction of formal acknowledgement and nothing else. In Concarneau, the story did not disappear. It moved instead into the particular repository where small communities keep their difficult histories, told from parent to child, absorbed into the texture of the harbor's identity, half legend and half wound. Hervé Pouloc, whose grandfather Emmanuel died in the last days of July 1930, spoke for what the verdict and its failure meant at the human scale. "Recognition is good," he said, "but you can't forget suffering." Those words are not a complaint against the inadequacy of historical memory. They are a statement about the specific gravity of a life extinguished by institutional indifference, a weight that no plaque or verdict or documentary record can fully lift from the people who carry it by inheritance. In December of 2013, an association was formally established in Concarneau with the explicit purpose of preserving the memory of the forgotten. Its full name translates as Bring to Life the Memory of the Forgotten of St. Paul Island. It was created and managed by Dominique Veriouvet and Maryvonne Tateosian, the niece and daughter of Julien Le Ouloudou, the survivor who had refused to leave the island in December 1930. The living descendants of the forgotten had organized, more than 80 years after the events, to ensure that the story would not dissolve entirely into the general amnesia that settles over catastrophes once the last direct witnesses have died. In 2015, 2 identical commemorative bronze plaques were installed bearing the names of the dead and the survivors. Victor Brunou, Paul Brunou, Emmanuel Pouloc, François Ramamonzi, Pierre Kilivic, and the living, Louis Erledon, Julien Le Ouloudou, Louise Brunou. One plaque was placed on Île Saint Paul itself, fixed to the volcanic rock above the crater harbor where the cannery once stood. It cannot be visited. The island has been declared a wilderness area under the authority of the French Southern and Antarctic territories, a protected natural site where access is restricted to scientific missions. The plaque stands there, read by no one, in the wind. The second plaque was installed on the seafront of Concarneau, overlooking the harbor from which these workers departed in October of 1929, in view of the boats that still go out and return, in view of the water that connects every fishing community to every sea. It is accessible to anyone. Laetitia Boisdin, the official in charge of cultural affairs for the municipality, said at the dedication, "It is not about nostalgia from the past. It is a duty of memory, because the forgotten should not be forgotten a second time." What happened on Île Saint Paul between March and December of 1930 was not a natural disaster. The island did not cause the deaths. The wind did not cause the deaths. The scurvy and the beriberi and the starvation that killed 5 people were caused by a company that made specific contractual promises to specific human beings, and then failed to honor those promises across a period of 9 months, while its workers died in sequence on a remote island without any means of calling for help. The Bosier brothers' culpability was affirmed by the French courts. Their company's inability to pay what the courts ordered is not a mitigating circumstance. It is the final accounting of what institutional negligence, at its most complete, actually looks like. Louise Le Brunou survived not by the cinematic qualities of wilderness heroism, but by the daily repetition of remaining alive inside conditions that had been made hostile, not by nature, but by corporate failure. She survived the birth of her daughter in a stone barracks room with no medical support. She survived the death of that daughter 2 months later. She survived the deaths of her husband and 2 colleagues. She survived 9 months of inadequate nutrition and constant wind on a volcanic island in the southern Indian Ocean. And then, in a choice that defies simple explanation, she stayed. The island took her daughter. It took her husband. It took Manuel Pouloc and François Ramamongi and Pierre Le Kilivic, who paddled into the Indian Ocean on a small boat and was swallowed by it. The island did not take Louise Le Brenou, and in the harbor town of Concarneau, on a seafront plaque that catches the same kind of Atlantic wind that the workers knew before they left, their names stand in bronze above the harbor, doing what names do when the people who carried them are gone, insisting, against the general movement of time, that they were here. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people who disappear from history not through catastrophe, but through neglect, and about what it means to remember them, please take a moment to like the video. It really helps the channel reach more people. And if you want more true stories like this one, stories of endurance, of institutional failure, and of the ordinary people caught between them, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.